it's a cliche, but we're shuffling deck chairs. If we're not dealing with the fundamental issue of what is driving the climate crisis and the source of our emissions, what is the point of these policies? This policy it's pointless. If you came to the election promising to reduce emissions, the onus is on you to reduce emissions.
One for Mum, one for Dad, one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and you might have seen that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, just released its latest report, and it's rather alarming. It contained a very clear message. There is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a safe, livable and sustainable future for humanity.
The United Nations has issued what it calls a survival guide for humanity in the face of unequivocal climate threats.
An incredibly depressing and landmark report.
But today's IPCC report is a how-to guide to defuse the climate time bomb.
Successfully tackling climate change requires global cooperation.
Is the world doing enough? You attended the climate talks. Are we doing enough as a human race?
Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast.
And we are very, very close to 1.5 degrees.
We need to move away from the present emissions towards lower emissions and even net zero or net negative emissions.
Let's pounce on it, let's build on it, let's do this.
This decision from the government to open up 10 new sites for gas and oil exploration.
This is not a sensible decision. The IPCC was so clear, no new coal or gas.
New fossil fuel projects are incompatible with avoiding dangerous climate change, a message which lies in stark contrast to the Labor government's Safeguard Mechanism Bill, which is currently before the Parliament. The bill, as it currently stands, relies on carbon offsets and accounting tricks to get Australia to net zero emissions, while still allowing up to 116 fossil fuel projects in the pipeline to go ahead, pumping even more emissions into the atmosphere. The Australia Institute has crunched the numbers on all those projects and what they would do for climate change, and to help explain it and break down those numbers today, I'm delighted to talk to Climate and Energy Program Director for the Australia Institute, Polly Hemming. G'day, Polly.
G'day, thanks, Ab.
So, Polly, let's start with the IPCC report. These things are always rather alarming reading, but a lot of headlines were reporting this is the final warning. What did this latest report have to say?
This report said the time to act is now. We have no time left. The time to act to have any chance at all of avoiding the worst catastrophic impacts of climate change is now.
It starts with parties immediately hitting the fast-forward button on their net zero deadlines to get to global net zero by 2050.
And this is based on basically a whole lot of other reports that the UN and the IPCC produces over time. This is essentially a summary of all their findings. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. It's not a report that was just carried out in the last year. The IPCC has reporting cycles which go for about 7 years, and the findings in this latest top-line report are a body of work that's been going since 2015, and it covers things like what are the impacts of climate change, what we know is happening now, what are the risks of not acting, what needs to be done to avoid those catastrophic impacts, and presents a whole lot of different models of what we can do or what's going to happen if we don't do anything.
And so it's based on the most up-to-date science, but it also includes what governments have actually done versus what they've said they will do, and kind of gives us an outlook about where we're headed. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's also important to remember that it's the world scientists writing the report, but governments also have input into this. So I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, the Australian government was found to have tried to influence the report. and take out some of the stronger language. And the reason why I mention that is that the IPCC essentially has to have full consensus on what it says. So while this report in itself is incredibly alarming, the language could have been a lot stronger. It's just there's likely to have been government influence.
So it's likely a conservative outlook.
Exactly, yeah.
And so amongst the awful findings was that we've already had, is it 1.1 degrees of warming?
That's right.
That's what we're currently experiencing already.
The rate of temperature rise in the last half century is the highest in 2,000 years. The 1.5 degree limit is achievable, but it will take a quantum leap in climate action.
So, Polly, the UN could not have been clearer in its messaging. Fossil fuels are incompatible with avoiding dangerous climate change. How important is that message to get out there?
Oh, it's hugely important, and the report in itself is not enough. You know, we get these reports every single year, and they kind of are part of the media cycle, and we forget so quickly. And I think in acknowledgement of that, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, came out the same day just to really drive home to wealthy countries especially, you need to act now. And he put out a call not just summarising the findings of the report, but basically saying that wealthy nations, including Australia, now need to sign a pact to reach net zero emissions in 2040, not 2050. We need to phase out coal power, and we need to block the extraction of any new gas and coal.
No new coal, and the phasing out of coal by 2030 in OECD countries and 2040 in all other countries. I count on all G20 leaders to have committed to ambitious new economy-wide nationally determined contributions encompassing all greenhouse gases and indicating their absolute emission cut targets for 2035 and 2040. The transition must cover the entire economy.
Yeah, so it's quite straightforward what the United Nations is asking wealthy countries like Australia to do. And it seems to me like fortuitous timing, because Australia is currently debating legislation that's supposed to reduce Australia's emission. That brings us to the safeguard mechanism. But before we get into the safeguard mechanism, the Australian Institute has some new research, because in direct contrast to what the IPCC and the world scientists and the United Nations are calling for, which is no new fossil fuel projects, Australia, as it turns out, actually has quite a few in the pipeline.
Just a few, yeah. Just a crazy 116 new fossil fuel projects listed.
116 new ones.
It's crazy, isn't it? And like you see the debates overseas, one new coal mine gets so much media attention. We've got 116, and no one seems to bat an eyelid. And these are the government's own figures. This is from something called the Resources and Energy Major Projects List. This is a list the government puts out every year where it lists all the new oil and gas and extractive projects, and they're listed as in development. That's the government's language. Mm-hmm. And what we worked out is that the emissions in Australia and overseas, and we'll get to the intricacies of that in a minute, but the total emissions from these 116 new projects would be 4.8 billion tonnes of CO2 equivalent by 2030.
4.8 billion tonnes.
Billion tonnes.
I mean, that just seems like a bonkers figure to me, and I'm not quite sure how to put that in context. Can you help me kind of, to a layperson, how big is that? How big are those emissions?
It's so abstract. So we'll break it. This is still a massive figure, but we'll break it down. The annual potential emissions from those would be 1.4 billion tonnes, and that is the equivalent of building 215 new coal-fired power stations.
That's a lot of coal-fired power stations, probably. That seems
that's even still hard to grasp, that figure.
Yeah,
it's
that's
astronomical.
A huge number. Plenty more than what Australia has in terms of current coal-fired power stations, which is still too many. And so that is just a huge figure of potential emissions were these projects to go ahead. And I think that neatly brings us back to the safeguards mechanism. That's the climate legislation currently before the Parliament that is supposed to reduce emissions, particularly from fossil fuel projects and fossil fuel companies. Polly, will the safeguard mechanism stop any of those fossil fuel projects from going ahead?
Well, this is the crazy thing about the political debate currently, you would think that any conversation about climate policy in Australia or emissions reductions or policies that we're going to reduce emissions would be designed to tackle the emissions from new fossil fuels and existing fossil fuel projects.
Yeah, like let's put existing to one side. Just the new ones. Surely it should stop new ones.
You would think that would be a fundamental part of the conversation, but that plays no role in any of Australia's climate policies. Instead, we have this thing that we've talked about before, the safeguard mechanism, which is designed to theoretically reduce some emissions from some facilities, but it's not fundamentally designed to stop new fossil fuel projects from going ahead, which is crazy because that's what a climate policy should do.
That's the source of the problem.
That's the source of the problem.
So that's pretty alarming. And it strikes me, as you said, that the debate just seems completely divorced from what we're hearing from the United Nations, from the International Energy Agency, and we're having a parliamentary debate on this exact issue, but it kind of seems to be nowhere in the debate.
Yeah, we're having a parliamentary debate that is completely disconnected and completely ignores this issue. And the IPCC round of reporting was started in 2015. I feel like the debate is still back in 2015. Anytime anyone says, shouldn't Australia be looking at new fossil fuel projects, and how is the safeguard mechanism going to deal with massive fossil fuel expansion? And the answer is invariably from government and industry, oh, you can't stop fossil fuels overnight. You know, it's irresponsible to suddenly turn the lights off or shut down coal-fired power stations, which is just a scare tactic. And no one is suggesting that. But that's where we're at. Like we've had this clarion call from Australian scientists, from the IPCC, from the UN saying stop extracting fossil fuels, and we're still in petty political debates where we're saying it's irresponsible and we can't turn the lights off, and distracting people with what is essentially spin and straw man arguments. So the safeguard is a conversation about how we're going to reduce emissions from 215 facilities, this arbitrary grouping of facilities from fossil fuel sectors, but also from industries that we actually need in the economy, and that do need to decarbonise, but need some support to do so. And going back to those big numbers, the entire safeguard mechanism is only ever going to reduce Australia's emissions by 205 million tonnes. You look at the direct emissions only from those projects as in development, again, forget the existing projects, the emissions from those in Australia is 164 million tonnes. So great, the safeguard, if it works, reduces emissions by 205 million tonnes. We've just introduced another 164 million tonnes. So it is baffling that we're having this conversation that is not tackling the fundamental issue.
Yeah.
The Greens have said that you'd be giving the UN the middle finger if you don't listen to them and block any new coal or gas mines and projects.
And that in fact Australia and other developed nations must phase out coal by 2030.
Because this is an ambitious plan, Mr Speaker, and when you're engaging in an ambitious plan, you need to give industry the flexibility to implement that plan.
If the safeguards does not go through, then we'll be debating this all the way through to the next election. That's where we're at this morning.
So you want the Greens to drop that demand and vote for the safeguard mechanism?
Yeah.
For the first time in a decade, we can seize the opportunity to reduce emissions from Australia's big emitters, or we can squander that opportunity.
Successfully tackling climate change requires global cooperation.
That we cannot afford to open up new coal and gas projects.
The other thing that the safeguard mechanism contains, which is very worrying, is offsets. Can you just explain to me the role of offsets in the safeguard mechanism?
So I've just said that safeguard mechanism is designed to reduce emissions. Mm-hmm. Actually, nothing has to be reduced in absolute terms under the safeguard mechanism. Theoretically, you can have an existing project or a new project increase its direct emissions or the emissions from its production, and all it has to do is to buy some offsets to stay within its its legal pollution limits. So on paper, it looks like they've broken even, but there is no reductions actually required. You can just purchase offsets, and we've talked a lot about this in podcasts and in webinars in the Australia Institute. Even if those offsets have integrity, nothing is being done to carry out the activities that are required for actual decarbonisation that would permanently displace fossil fuels. You have to buy offsets year after year. And if you've got all these industries that are inherently what we call hard to abate, like they're going to find it hard to reduce their emissions.
Like cement, for example.
If people are going to argue for a cap on the use of carbon credits, they need to explain how hard to abate sectors will achieve the targets. How will cement achieve its targets with the technology that is currently emerging and is not yet available without access to ACCUs and carbon credits, Mr Speaker?
But, I mean, cement makes up 4% of the safeguard. We're not really talking about cement. We're talking about gas and coal.
So they keep pointing to cement, but actually, if we wanted, we could just help cement specifically.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's teeny weeny. So it's majority of emissions are from gas and coal facilities. I'm sure the CEOs of those companies think that they're hard to abate. They're not. We've got viable technologies that could easily replace majority of fossil fuels quite quickly. But of course, what's the appetite for gas and coal companies to reduce their emissions or permanently phase down their emissions? Of course they're going to be buying offsets, and the Australian government itself has put a price cap on offsets. The department recently in a Senate inquiry said it doesn't even think the price of offsets are going to get to that $75 price cap.
But just in case,
we've got this price cap, which is nothing. Like, you look at what the internal carbon price is anticipated to be, and it's in the hundreds of dollars. Companies like Woodside have an internal carbon price of something like $86. What's Woodside going to opt for? Like internal reductions, or is it going to buy the offsets?
Yeah, offsets that are cheaper by the ton.
So that's before we even get to the integrity issues with offsets. Nothing's being decarbonised. We're having this increasing demand of abatement from the land sector. Like, we're expecting farmers basically to have the supply of offsets to sell to companies. And then if those offsets don't actually do what they say on the tin, if they don't
have integrity,
if they don't represent a reduction happening somewhere else, you're actually ending up with emissions increasing when a company buys an offset to justify emitting a tonne of CO2.
Yeah. So pretty big loopholes and problems with the safeguard mechanism, safe to say.
Pretty big loopholes that are going to be very hard to fix until you have gas and coal and the fossil fuel industry out of the picture. You know, the safeguard possibly could be a good tool to help industry decarbonise. To be clear, there's a lot of sectors the safeguard doesn't cover, and, you know, cement's only 4%. There are a lot of cement facilities that aren't covered by the safeguard mechanism that will continue emitting. But if we dealt with the fundamental issue of what is driving emissions to increase in Australia, i.e. fossil fuel expansion, all these problems are a lot smaller.
Yeah.
And the safeguard actually could be a good policy. But the idea that not me, but the government and industry are desperately trying to get it passed and forge ahead with it because, you know, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good and blah, 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 whatever they're saying is completely false. Deal with the big issue, and then we can have a talk about this sort of very niche area of Australia's emissions that need to be tackled.
The safeguard mechanism is a pay-to-pollute model, and the cost to continue polluting as usual will be pocket change for many of these hugely profitable multinational companies.
There is no ceiling to the offsets polluters can buy. The cost of those offsets will be less than 0.1% of their profits, giving polluters no reason to cut their emissions.
I do not accept the premise of the honourable member's question. I do not. It is the case that the government is allowing access to offsets in our safeguard mechanism reforms. Absolutely we are.
The safeguard mechanism has to have integrity. It has to actually be reducing emissions.
So just to bring us back, I guess, to the actual objective, in summary, the IPCC, the United Nations, the International Energy are saying no new coal and gas. They're saying no financing for coal and gas, no subsidies. They're saying take this seriously and urgently, and we're pretty much just like hitting the gas on new fossil fuel projects with few impediments in the way. Was that an accurate summary?
Yeah, we're not even having the conversation. We just keep pulling out the same lines about we can't shut down coal and gas overnight. You know, something is better than nothing. This is progress. Let's blame the Greens. It's just this really tired kind of treadmill of the same old arguments, completely ignoring the 4.8 billion tonne elephant in the room.
And yeah, the actual substance of the issue.
Exactly.
At all levels, governments, communities, individuals have made climate change somebody else's problem.
It tells us that climate change is a real threat to human and planetary well-being.
We need to move away from the present emissions towards lower emissions and even net zero or net negative emissions.
So when it comes down to it, Polly, I guess we can judge the safeguard mechanism on whether emissions will decrease. As it stands, will Australia's emissions decrease by the rate that we need them to meet our targets?
I think it's not unreasonable to say that actually the safeguard mechanism could result in increasing emissions, predominantly because it's a way of the government looking like it's doing something, so it can lock in that government complacency up to the next election. They can say, look, we've got the safeguard, it's tackling emissions. It also provides an illusion of regulatory accountability. So these enormous gas expansion projects can be approved on the basis that they will be, in inverted commas, regulated, when really their emissions are just going to explode and exceed what the entire safeguard mechanism is going to do. Then you've got the issues of whether offsets actually reduce emissions. So I think it's fair to say that no, the safeguard mechanism is not going to reduce emissions. And one way of testing that is looking at what life looks like with and without the safeguard mechanism. And if our key climate policy is not designed to stop new fossil fuel expansion, then whether it gets up or not, the emissions will be negligible. The only thing that will happen is that the price of offsets will probably increase.
I just want to go back to the total emissions for all these potential fossil fuel projects. And you talked about the fact that it includes the emissions for if they're burned overseas, what is known as Scope 3 emissions. When we do those calculations, can you just explain to me why it's important to include those as well in terms of the climate crisis?
Yeah, of course, because you will often hear Minister Bowen or even Minister Plibersek justify the fact that we don't need to count the emissions that we export, basically the gas and coal that we produce that we then export that's burnt overseas, because according to international accounting rules, they're not our problem, basically. But the physical impacts that we're seeing in Australia are a result of global CO2 emissions increasing. They're not limited to the fact that we're burning a certain amount of fossil fuels in Australia, and there's no boundaries or walls around
in the atmosphere.
Yeah, so you actually can't just section it off like that.
So a ton of coal burned in Japan or our gas burned in South Korea still causes our climate change.
Yeah, exactly. And there's an address to the Press Club yesterday where Kerry Schott, who is the chair of Australia's Carbon Market Institute, who's an offset lobby group, basically said, it would be really great if other countries started having accounting as good as ours, because then theoretically the gas and coal that they import is then counted in their accounts and regulated in the same way, so it all kind of works out. But it's not that simple, and we, as a very wealthy country with the technology and leadership and I suppose regional influence, we do have a moral duty to address the supply side issue. It's the drug dealer's defence. I can't help it if there's demand. I'm just going to keep selling it as long as there's a market. But
it doesn't matter what harm it does.
Exactly. We don't mine asbestos anymore, even if there was demand, because it was incredibly harmful. You take away the product that is killing people, and if Australia was really going to be a good neighbour to countries like the Pacific, we would assist them to decarbonise their own economies.
That is really one of the key messages from Pacific leaders over several years now when they engage with Australia. Their point is, we just keep exporting all this stuff that does get burned. Can you please stop it?
Yeah. Can you please stop it? Increasingly loud and desperate calls, and Labor came to the election promising to be a better neighbour to the Pacific, and it appears that despite numerous visits to various countries in the Pacific, we're ignoring the fundamental, the number one thing that we have been asked to do, as you say, over a number of years, which is stop producing fossil fuels. It is killing our countries, and Australia is expecting Pacific countries to co-host a UN climate conference with it. If I was a Pacific leader, which I'm not, I'm not, but I can't see any reason why any of these countries would want to support Australia's bid when Australia is so extractive, excuse the pun, in terms of fossil fuels, but also in its relationship with Pacific nations. We've lent money to gas companies to set up gas projects in PNG. We really haven't helped these countries decarbonise at all.
And so we really have to get on with electrification of really gearing up in terms of renewables at the supply side, and then at households, actually working with them to get off gas, to move to electric appliances, electric vehicles. Across Australia, the average household could be saving up to $5,000 a year if we get this transition right.
So if you had one final message for, I guess, the government or even for the Senate as this debate approaches, what would it be when it comes to the safeguard mechanism?
Just trying to temper my language a little bit. It's a cliche, but we're shuffling deck chairs. If we're not dealing with the fundamental issue of what is driving the climate crisis and the source of our emissions, what is the point of these policies? This policy it's pointless. Not even in terms of the safeguard, but if you ran on any kind of climate platform at the last election, you have an obligation to listen to the science. You have an obligation to listen to the IPCC and the UN of which our country is a member, and do what is required. If Australians voted for climate action in 2022, saying that you're implementing some kind of obscure, complex technical mandate is actually not fundamentally fulfilling that promise. If you came to the election promising to reduce emissions, the onus is on you to reduce emissions.
Thanks very much, Polly. I feel like it won't be the last time we talk about this. I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
This episode was recorded live on Wednesday, the 22nd of March 2023, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, including the fossil fuel emissions paper from major fossil fuel projects, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. We're also launching a 30-second TV ad that explains how carbon offsets are fueling Australia's net zero fraud. You can donate to that, or to help this podcast keep going at australiainstitute.org.au. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Polly is at Polly J Hemming, and our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing from Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.